I'm going to give kind of a bit of an overview of one chapter from my book, and I felt that this chapter would be a good one because it brings together a lot of the themes that I think are really integral to, why happiness became a particular problem. And I think it kind of inadvertently answers, should we be happy? Is that something that people should strive for? So I hope that it isn't going to sound too academic or off the mark. I'm not really sure how it'll go, but just sort of bear with me. So I'm not really sure how familiar you might be with the happiness issue, but in recent years it's become really difficult to ignore. It's become an oft-stated goal of public policy and state intervention. The shelves of bookshops are stocked with publications with titles like The How of Happiness, The Happiness Hypothesis, and Why Modern Life Makes It Hard to Be Happy. Governments around the world are considering measures of subjective well-being as indicators of progress and tools for appraising policy. The fascination is fed by a seemingly constant stream of academic publishing on the topic, from the economics of happiness to a new subdiscipline of positive psychology, and even the founding of several dedicated journals. Although it would seem that the rising interest in happiness represents a shift toward focusing on the brighter side of the human condition, it's clear that there's something in these discussions that's not exactly about the celebration of human health and well-being. As early as 2004, newspaper headlines began to proclaim the existence of an epidemic of unhappiness. It was claimed that unhappiness is Britain's worst social problem, and that's a direct quote. It was not long before the speeches of politicians and public figures, like David Cameron especially, who, for example, proclaimed that we have the unhappiest children in the developed world, these speeches began to be littered with a concern for happiness. So emergent from these developments is the conclusion that happiness has become a serious problem faced by Western societies, and indeed the world, that we would ignore only at our individual and collective peril. People are miserable, stressed, depressed, or simply not as happy as they could be. They're amateurs, going about pursuing happiness in all the wrong ways, proponents of the happiness science proclaim. Even when happiness is not explicitly set forth as a problem, a cursory glance at the news, academic studies, and outputs of countless think tanks would lead anyone to the conclusion that many, if not all of the world's problems, could be solved by reorienting beliefs, desires, and goals of individuals, even entire nations, to the true meaning of happiness as discovered by science. Backed by prolific scientific research, it seems that the key to happiness finally lies within our grasp. So a persistent question is, why? Why did this interest arise now? It might seem obvious that there was this pressing problem of unhappiness in society. But what I tried to do is, first of all, describe what is this problem. Well, I've given you a little bit of an overview of this epidemic of unhappiness. So it's, although it seems really, really positive, there's a negative sort of negative frame that lurks beneath. So I've tried to describe exactly what is the problem of happiness. But also, I've tried to give some of the reasons behind it in terms of context, process, and rhetoric. So context is, things like, social structures, economic structures, but also cultural beliefs, and culture in the sense of the existing stock of frames available to make sense of life at a given time. But also the process of claims making. We tend to see social problems as just arising sort of from the ether, their objective harm being the reason why they sort of emerge and become important issues. But we often fail to realize that people have to take hold of particular conceptions of the world and press them in service of, and press for attention on their behalf. So we have to understand problems as problematic and problematic in a certain way. We have to group together different kinds of issues under a certain umbrella of meaning. And then people actually have to campaign to make those social issues, right? I don't know if you already know that, but it's, it's the sort of constructionist approach to social problems, sort of basic sociological approach. So that's sort of my outlook. I look at social problems as constructed as the outcome of human activity. And so what I do is I sort of deconstruct and look at the activities that are involved and the sort of cultural resources drawn upon to make sense of the world implicit in happiness claims. So happiness seems really, really positive. When I say the happiness problem, it's interesting that I don't say a problem of unhappiness. Well, happiness is problematized both explicitly and implicitly. Happiness and its satellite terminologies are often explicitly forwarded as problems, so it is often explicitly claimed that people aren't happy, have become unhappy, or are simply not happy enough. Even if they don't realize they have a problem, surely everyone, it's claimed, could use guidance on how to be happier. But also through positing incongruities, through misaligning particular phenomena with happiness, they are sort of there's an implicit problem that's created. So the most common misalignment is wealth. So wealth is posited as detrimental to happiness, as as at least being unconnected to happiness. So through this misalignment, a problem is created, but it also allows people to maintain a sort of positive connotation. So that positive orientation to social problems, to problematizing wealth and so on, becomes a reason for its novelty and coverage. So that's another form of problematization, is problematizing other phenomena through the language of happiness by saying that these things are incongruent with happiness. And the claims makers frequently draw on the language of science when they do that. So it's often also taken for granted that human beings are by default in need of guidance on the pursuit of happiness and the conduct of life. While the distinction reflects more of a continuum than a clear-cut division, it nonetheless highlights that although claims making frequently appears positive, it's based on deficits. So expertise, it's implied, is needed when not just when things go wrong, but also to ensure that things go right. So that's another form of implicit problematization. I'll give you some examples. When Martin Seligman and Mihai Csikszentmihalyi first introduced positive psychology, one of their paragraphs in their statement was, "Psychology concentrates on repairing damage within a diseased model of human functioning. This almost exclusive attention to pathology neglects the fulfilled individual and the thriving community. The aim of positive psychology is to begin to catalyze a change in the focus of psychology from preoccupation only with repairing the worst things in life to also building positive qualities." Sounds really positive. But although it's couched in positive rhetoric, there's an implied deficit. If we have a fulfilled individual and thriving community, then presumably they don't need the attention of psychology. What is implied is that this kind of functioning requires intervention. And we see this, I see this all the time. For example, more recently, there have been demands for or calls for a positive sociology, that sociologists too should start to look at how people are made happy and how they can possibly be made happier. One sociologist argues that sociologists should be paying attention not only to all the social problems in the world, but also on how people flourish, right? And he points out that happiness discourses also tend to implicitly problematize. They posit happiness as a problem. And he says, no, actually, people are made happy in all sorts of different circumstances. So he points out that there's this implicit problematization. He says we need to reject that. But then he goes on to say that happiness has been implicitly assumed to exist in the absence of the various problems, and the work of promoting mental health is implicitly assumed to be the work of preventing, alleviating, and curing mental illness. Where psychology and economics have monopolized the happiness industry, he argues that social sciences must, quote, develop their own ways of paying positive attention to the social facilitation of well-being, end quote. But if happiness and well-being are not a problem, one wonders why they need to be facilitated in this way. So when opening up new areas of expertise frequently involves an implicit problematization. So in the past, when people were focusing, and people still do focus on social problems, this is a sort of new sort of marginal discourse that's emerged within sociology, but at least the traditional focus on removing barriers and solving problems implies the implicit belief that once you remove these barriers, people will be free to get on with things. But allowing that people must also focus, that experts must also focus on facilitating this getting on with things implies that left to their own devices, people actually can. So there's this implicit belief that without expert intervention, the natural state of affairs or the natural state of people is to be disoriented toward happiness and have this sort of uncertainty about how to get on with life. So not only do experts need to solve problems, they also need to teach people how to get on when there are no problems, or when these problems are removed. Okay, so that put simply is what I mean by happiness as a social problem. The claim implicitly or explicitly stated that human beings are disoriented when it comes to happiness, that it's a special skill, that it requires special expertise, and the failure to appreciate this lies at the heart of many social problems. And in my research, I focused on the news media as a starting point for sort of identifying claims and tracking their proliferation through different media. So I use the news media as my starting point, but then I sort of move out into popular books and policy and things like that. But throughout these discourses, everything from crime to school underachievement to social inequality, all of this is said to be remediable by if only we could just find out, what it, or use the knowledge that we already have of what really makes people happy, then we wouldn't have a crisis. We wouldn't have school underachievement. We wouldn't have, and so on. So that's how happiness is used in these discourses. Well, I think part of the reason why we want to use these emotional signifiers is we're in a culture that is already accustomed to hearing claims that posit emotional deficits at the center of narratives about social problems. Happiness claims are both drawn from and add to this broader cultural context, one key aspect of which is positing a view of human beings as fragile and constantly at risk of emotional damage and vulnerable to social contagion. So if we look at sort of broader trends in social problems, we've moved from social pathology perspectives where the individual, where society was seen as good, but the individual was seen as bad. And now it's almost flipped around, where society is seen as bad, but the individual is seen as vulnerable. So we need to protect the individual from these contagions. So although there's this, the influence between the human being and society is posited as the sort of the negative influences of society will get into the person, like advertising and things like that. And they need to be insulated and protected from these negative effects. Also more broadly, something that I talk about and put a lot of attention to, and I have absolutely no time to talk about in any kind of detail now, is that I think that we've seen a decline of a sort of a broader decline in belief in the perfectibility of society. So there's three major issues, three major sort of contextual themes that I think happiness claims draw on. A loss of belief in the perfectibility of society, which I'll come to in a moment, a vulnerability narrative of human action, and of sort of an inability to criticize capitalism in ways that are, in deeper economic ways. So our critiques of capitalism have become limited to sort of emotional critiques of capitalism or really surface level critiques of capitalism. Okay. So I mentioned that I try to explain the rise of the issue in terms of context, process, and rhetoric. So process is the process of making claims. Throughout happiness discussions, it tends to be insiders. It wasn't a sort of bottom-up movement. Happiness claims emerged initially within sort of think tanks. Initially, it was experts and things like that. But this expertise was taken up by people closely connected to what we call the polity, people who have easy access to policymakers and things like that. And they campaigned for this issue to be sort of put on the public agenda. And obviously although this was starting to happen in the 1990s, there wasn't really a dedicated campaign to put happiness on the public agenda until 2003, most obviously with Richard Laird. He was the first person to really consciously take the issue up and make it a campaign. And his claims making was particularly successful. He was quite good with putting together quite persuasive rhetoric. The most common claim that he propounded was the paradox of prosperity. And that is the most common claim if you quantify the claims from the samples that I've drawn from the news media. This idea that money doesn't buy happiness, that as economic growth rises, happiness levels stay the same. That claim was, he would put that at the forefront of he would constantly sort of say that. So in articles that he placed in the news media, in the first paragraphs, he'd mention it at least 3 or 4 times. So that was the major claim, and that was one of the claims got noticed. So I think it was intuitively he knew that there was something about that claim that people really responded to. And what's interesting is that the first time that I heard that claim, I was about 10 years ago. And I was a very different person 10 years ago. And I didn't think critically about it at all. I'd heard it, and I went, I fancied myself a proper left-leaning kind of person. And I went, see, money doesn't buy happiness. That's what I said. And I thought of myself as left. And that was really before I started reading Karl Marx and understanding kind of what it used to mean to be a leftist and how different that idea is from what leftism had been in the past. And that actually the drive for material wealth was once a really important part of progressive movements, but that's sort of flipped around now. Okay, so all of these sort of themes come together if we look at the rhetoric of happiness. So it's not just happiness that's the main signifier in claims making about the problem. It's well-being, eudaimonia, flourishing, or in English, eudaimonia, I guess is what you'd say. I speak Greek, so I find it very difficult to know sometimes exactly what you're meant to say. But so what is it about these particular signifiers that made them really powerful? Obviously, people had to take hold of them to make them powerful, but there has to be something about them that sort of chimes with they chime with the plausibility structures of a given society at a given time. Well, I think that the rhetoric of happiness was appealing for at least three reasons. First of all, it's broadly appealing, so it speaks to people at the level of the individual body and mind. So at a time when we've lost the broader ideologies, when you can't count on a particular constituency to hold a particular ideology, these sort of biological claims are able to speak to people at a deeper level precluded from older ideologies. So I can speak to people on the basis, I can make a claim to truth that I can't make on the basis of ideologies of the past. So I'd say, do this thing because it will make you happy. Science says so. Not because I say so. It's not based on individual opinion. It's based on so-called science. So moral claims you're able to impute moral claims with a scientific basis. Because we've lost this sort of shared ideologies. More often, you have to talk to people at this sort of broadly agreeable, sort of basic level. But also, happiness is a kind of floating signifier. And floating signifiers become more and more powerful at a time when you've lost these sorts of ideologies. So a colleague of mine, Nikos Sotirakopoulos, a former colleague at the University of Kent, he did a study. He's studying the Occupy movement, and he looked at Occupy, the expression of Occupy Greece. It was anaganatismeni sto syntagma. Anyways, the frustrated of Syntagma Square. So he talked about how equality was used as a sort of floating signifier, something that was so vague and positive that everybody could connect to it, and it could connect with anybody regardless of what your belief system was. It's something, how do you argue with that? In the United States, it's like motherhood and apple pie. Although I'm Canadian, we still share that culture. So it was really, really positive, and it was able to get a sort of broad base of appeal and attract people into the square. But it was so vague that it was impossible to sort of form a coherent movement out of. Now, if the goal is to get everybody into a square and simply express your disagreement, then that's a success. But if your goal is to actually solve a problem, then that's not actually all that successful. And more, our sort of goals are, we've moved away from instrumental politics, the instrumental politics of sort of class politics, meant to solve a problem, towards symbolic politics, which is expressive of a problem, but the action isn't actually directed toward any concrete output. It's the act is the end in itself in symbolic politics. So things like equality and happiness become really, as floating signifiers, become really, really powerful in an age when instrumental politics has declined and symbolic politics has risen. Happiness also has radical and utopian connotations. Its use in the, famously, its use in the American Declaration of Independence acts as a potent reminder that it once played a significant role in rhetoric of revolutions past. It allows claims makers, therefore, to evoke a revolutionary spirit and a sense of bringing purpose and meaning to political questions that might otherwise seem dry and out of touch with everyday experience. And the centralization and personalization of the concept reduces issues to the lowest common denominator. Yet it does so while painting a picture of large-scale social change. So it sounds really big and broad. It sounds like a really big goal, which is, it echoes this be the change mentality heard everywhere from American President Barack Obama to refrigerator magnets distributed by Oxfam and placards at protest marches. But since market society is the only society possible, radical claims frequently amount to insulating individuals from its ostensibly polluting effects. So we have this sort of broader discourse that sounds, really radical and revolutionary, but at the end of the day, if you look at the conclusions, you look at the solutions that are posited for the problem, they're all about shifting attention away. So I've sort of quantified all of the solutions given in newspaper discourses, and it's about shift attention away from economic growth. It's this re-enchantment of modernity through emotion. So we'll abstract from history, emotion and meaning and things like that, but we'll still have everything the way that it is. It will insulate you, so you should meditate in the workplace. We should change our parenting styles. We should teach children the true meaning to happiness isn't in flashy cars and so on. So there's this sort of really radical critique, so-called radical critique of capitalism, but at the end of the day, when you define a problem in emotional terms, the solution is also emotional. So when they say, economic growth doesn't bring happiness, why are we pursuing economic growth? Like as though it was just this mistake or something like that. The solution is emotional. So it's, we should, each of us in our individual lives shouldn't focus so much on money. We should all focus on what makes us individually happy. But interestingly, for those in the know, promotion of happiness, for example, in the workplace is frequently promoted on the basis of increasing profit. So for anyone who knows that profit is a necessity, happiness is going to increase your profits. But for workers, happiness is for your own self-fulfillment. So it speaks to everyone. It's this really broad discourse with, it speaks to the left for particular reasons and it speaks to the right for particular reasons. And when you have a discourse like that, the power to become really pervasive and echoed, all over the place is really strong. For example, in Greece, there was a Citibank press release in 2005, which interestingly you can no longer find anywhere on the internet, but I happen to have saved it, where it says, the new slogan for Citibank is "Ευτυχία γράφεται με epsilon, όχι με euro," which means happiness is written with epsilon, rather not the e sign, right? So based on new research, Citibank has found that people care more about their families and so on than happiness. So that's what we're really going to focus on. Now, a few years later, as the country spiraled into financial crisis, anarchists had written that slogan on the walls in Greece, which I find really funny. I think it's a great example of this convergence of interests. When it comes down to the sort of nitty-gritty, you don't go, I don't strike and ask my employer to pay me less. You want more. That's what people have traditionally been fighting for, more of the social product. That's what workers have been fighting for. But at a higher level of abstraction, surely we can all agree that money doesn't buy happiness, right? So when you talk about things in this sort of vague, abstract way, we can all agree, and it makes it very, very difficult to think about how something can be contested. So it transfers our discussions onto this sort of very narrow field where, of common ground, and we're sort of stuck in that frame. So positing happiness is something, well, we should all consider happiness, shouldn't we? And we go, well, of course we should. And then we're all sort of stuck in this agreeable sort of territory with the sort of the parameters of discourse are already decided. Just, how am I doing for time?
Got 5 minutes.
Okay, so I just want to focus on eudaimonia. Sorry. Okay, so towards the present, there's been this sort of shift away. So if you think about, I think that there's been this kind of cycle of emotional signifiers in society. So in the past, it wasn't that long ago when we saw self-esteem posited as the cause and solution to all of life's problems, all the social problems of the world. And indeed, Martin Seligman, who was initially a critic of self-esteem, or he at least wrote a chapter criticizing self-esteem in 1995, he rejected self-esteem as the, puffery. It gives this all-encompassing answer to all of these problems. And then 3 years later, he posits happiness or subjective well-being in a similar way. And then a few years later, well, in 2011, he sort of retracted that and posited, no, it's Aristotle, it's flourishing. That is what we need to be focusing on. So I think emotional signifiers in society are going through this sort of cycle of discovery, adoption, expansion, and exhaustion. Because there's this sort of unending appetite for these emotional signifiers. When we've lost that economic critique of society, when we're not able to look very deep into the problems of the world, we start to use these sort of romantic critiques, these emotional critiques of capitalism. And I think that we've moved, happiness seems really passé now. It moved on to subjective well-being and then flourishing, and I think now resilience, and there are some rumblings of love more recently. But it's really interesting that Aristotle started to be championed by a lot of people. If you look at Aristotle's conceptualization of eudaimonia, it's a conceptualization of perfection, a natural end that, while one may progress toward it, is essentially the realization of a fixed or stationary ideal. For Aristotle, anything that's in the process of perfecting cannot be perfect. That which is perfect is complete. Both Aristotle and later Thomas Aquinas saw becoming perfect as the realization of the inherent potentiality of a thing, the actualization of a perfect condition in which it can rest. Yet part of the progressive force of modernity, or at least reflective of it, was the gradual movement away from perfection as an absolute ideal toward an incremental and unlimited perfectibility. Hence, William Godwin was able to write that perfectible meant not capable of being brought to perfection, but being continually made better and receiving perpetual improvement. Something that is perfect would cease to improve, and thus the paradox is that the greatest perfection is imperfection. True perfection, philosophers began to reason, is ceaseless. As H.G. Wells pointed out in 1905, utopias of his time were no longer the perfect static states of classical antiquity, but kinetic, taking shape as a hopeful stage leading to a long ascent of stages. But the later 20th century would see dystopias flourish as never before. Enlightenment ideals of rationality and progress enjoy far less validation than previous centuries. Today, the Enlightenment belief in inevitable and unending improvement is likely to be deemed naive, misguided, or even dangerous by the liberally minded. Whereas the young or left Hegelians and later scientific socialists had excitedly cultivated the revolutionary seed of Hegel's contrast between endless reproduction of nature and the progressiveness of mankind in search of perfectibility, as well as his notion of the world as a complex of processes, of endless becoming, not being, becoming. Today there's a pervasive desire to halt this ceaseless movement. The yearning for eudaimonia, I think, is a yearning for a return to happiness not in what will be or is becoming, but simply in being. And obviously not without good reason. If the sort of resonant horrors of the past century have really shaken our faith in progress, and there's this sort of pervasive fear about the human hand on history is seen as a really negative thing. You talk about the human footprint is really, really negative. So for anyone wishing to reinstate the spirit of utopia, it has to be done in a sort of naturalistic way. Or an imagination. So you can sort of ideally smooth out contradictions that can't be worked out in reality, or it's a sort of naturalist kind of utopia. And I think that's what, if you look at some of the claims about happiness, although it's based on science, there's this really, really strong claim to science, and the language of scientism is really, really prominent. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Right, the happiness science is portrayed as simply a discovery. It's not actually changing people, it's simply directing people back to their true nature. So when claims makers talk about, we should restructure, the most radical claims are a restructuring of society to harmoniously attune with our unchanging human nature. So we've discovered what makes people happy, and society is, incongruous with this. We need to structure society, we need to structure social policy around this sort of unchanging human nature. So this utopia that's imagined is essentially a natural utopia. It's based on this sort of this animalistic subject that doesn't change. So, right. Right, okay. So just sort of to bring everything together, I had wanted to go through this chapter because I felt like it brought in a lot of things, but I think actually I will probably just leave it, and then it'll probably be better for you to ask me exactly what I'm on about. Yeah, so I'll just leave it there.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ashley.